On behalf of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and its youth initiative Reverse the Trend, Southeast and South Asia chapter, we are honored to welcome you here today to this panel discussion on the Israel-Iran conflict and broadly on preventing nuclear escalation. We are fortunate to have an incredible lineup of speakers with us today: Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Director of the Society for Policy Studies; Dr. Emad Kiyaei, Director of the Middle East Treaty Organization; Sharon Dolev, Executive Director of the Middle East Treaty Organization; Dr. Salma Malik, Associate Professor at Quaid-i-Azam University; and of course, Dr. Ivana Hughes, President of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. The recent tensions between Israel and Iran have once again raised fears of nuclear escalation in the Middle East and beyond. Today, we aim to explore the potential ramifications of this conflict and gain insights into the perspectives of various regional actors. I would like to take a moment to also thank the RTT South and Southeast Asia team, Amir, Adam, and Iza, for their invaluable contributions in organizing this event. I am also deeply grateful to David, a Nuclear Age Peace Foundation intern and RTT youth activist based in New York, for his support. But without further ado, we're excited to begin this discussion, and I'm first pleased to invite Sharon Dolev to share her perspective on the conflict, nuclear risk, and disarmament more broadly. Thank you very much, and we're excited to continue.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, and thank you, David, for organizing that. I would like to start and say that the Iran-Israeli conflict, or the Israeli-Iran conflict, is not a nuclear conflict. I mean, what everybody here is about is nuclear talks, but actually the conversation between Iran and Israel was always actually conventional. Even the last war was more conventional than anything else. The only nuclear thing about it was the attack on nuclear facilities in Iran. So it will sound weird to some of you maybe, but Iran is not a nuclear armed state. There's so much talk about Iran's nuclear weapons that people assume that Iran is a nuclear armed state. I want to say just a little bit about the history. Emad is much better at this than I am. But I want to remind that before the revolution in Iran, Israel and Iran were in good relations. Actually, the nuclear program in Iran, the civil nuclear program in Iran, was something that Israel was very happy about during the Shah. Actually, Israel recommended the US to assist Iran with a nuclear program. Since then, we can hear a lot about the conversation that Iran and Israel have that is not a very useful conversation. Iran doesn't recognize Israel, doesn't name Israel by name. Talks about the illegitimacy of Israel to exist sometime. Yet the war between Iran and Israel until this year was a conventional war, mainly by proxy. So Iran surrounds Israel with proxy collaborators like Hezbollah, assist Hamas, in Yemen, the Houthis, that also until the last war were not part of the conflict with Israel, and Israel attacking facilities, but usually not directly, but through cyber actions and by assassinating the scientist. None of this, of course, is helpful, but pay attention to the fact again that this was not a nuclear tensions. In 2012, there was a belief that Iran is very close to break into nuclear weapons, and during the Obama administration, there were calls to attack Iran, both from Israel and from the US. It was civil society then, by the way, that kept pushing for talks, don't bomb talks, when even Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, used to say that all options are on the table. When he was talking about Iran, he was talking about sanctions or war. He was not talking about an agreement. Yet, an agreement was achieved. And the JCPOA, or the Iran deal, came into force, putting Iran under the most comprehensive safeguards that any states agreed to. So we have an agreement that works, and one person is really unhappy about it. And this person is Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. And why Netanyahu feels so pushed by this agreement? Netanyahu inside Israel, forgive me for being very blunt, the destroyer of democracy in Israel, was a prime minister, still is a prime minister, that doesn't have any ability to really work towards what Israel is needed internally. And he doesn't have to, as long as he keeps Iran as an existential threat. So Iran uses existential threats wordings, and Netanyahu, for him, it's the best, because all he has to do that is to say that he's protecting Israel from Iran, and he keeps winning elections on that. And suddenly there's an agreement that is something that even a specialist in Israel, usually working for Prime Minister office, said was a good agreement, and yet this agreement threatens Netanyahu so much that when Trump gets elected, he's working extremely hard in order to make the US withdraw from this agreement. Sorry, I'm a bit cold. So what does it mean when the US or the Trump administration are withdrawing from a working agreement? Apart from putting back sanctions or not removing sanctions from Iran, the biggest injury outside the zone is diplomacy, because we tend to believe that agreements are something that should work as long as the sides play their role in the agreement. Iran played its role in the agreement. The European states, more or less, because not enough sanctions were removed when the agreement was taking place. But then the US breaks a working agreement, meaning that any future agreement will be harder to achieve. But even worse, agreement that will be achieved in the future won't be trusted. And that's dangerous. This is endangering the future of diplomacy. The Biden administration was trying to get back to, in some way, back to the agreement, and it was Trump that, in his bully way, pushed Iran back to negotiations. And during these negotiations, Israel attacked Iran, and the US joined. And it's extremely important to remember that there were talks during this attack. And again, there were lots of casualties, lots of destruction. But again, the biggest injured was diplomacy. Because if you attack during negotiations, how can we push states to trust this kind of negotiations? Now, I don't want to go into all the details, but I do want to talk a little bit about the power of civil society. Nuclear weapon in the Middle East is something that the world keeps talking about. Only one state in the Middle East right now possesses them, which is Israel. And Israel is also the one state that is not party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and does not take part in any of the international conversations of risk reduction or disarmament. But since 1974, there were calls for a nuclear weapon free zone in the Middle East, followed by calls for weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, which means chemical, biological, and nuclear. The importance of moving from nuclear to weapons of mass destruction means that Israel is not the only player we're talking about. Yet, if you pay attention to decisions and to resolutions like the 1995 resolution at the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They called for a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, which was something that was not achievable. Because if you call in a body for a nuclear weapon-free zone, where the only state that possesses nuclear weapons is not party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it means that you're calling for something that you believe is impossible. In the Middle East Treaty Organization, one of the first things that we've done was to map the obstacles for a nuclear weapon or weapon of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, and to see how come the topic that is being most discussed around the NPT, around every international forum, is about something that most diplomats, when asked, think was impossible. I don't want to make a very long story even longer. I try to make it very short, but one of the things that we found was that while calling for a nuclear weapon-free zone or a weapon of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, most of the diplomats from the zone and beyond were working on something that they believed was impossible. And that's why even something like a draft treaty for the zone was something that looked as an impossible text. What we've done as civil society was to imagine, we just set and imagine that actually the states that are calling for such a zone actually want to achieve the zone that they're talking about. What if the states actually wanted? And we came up with a draft treaty, and this draft treaty, followed by 4 other draft treaties to show that there was more than one possibility, were used in order to push the states in the zone for more constructive work. In 2018, there was a UN resolution calling for a yearly annual conference on a weapon of mass destruction free zone, that the aim of these meetings under the Secretary General of the UN is to achieve a treaty, a text that all states under consensus can agree to. So this is another thing that is happening side by side with the Iran deal. All states, including Iran, in the Middle East, are taking part of this annual meeting, and they actually reach consensus, which is something that usually doesn't happen in UN conferences, to actually reach consensus every year. Israel is the only one that from the Middle East doesn't participate, and the US from the nuclear armed states is the only one that also boycott this meeting. But this meeting takes place every year with too little attention from the international forum, from civil society, and even sometimes by the states that take part of it themselves when they are in other bodies. So while diplomacy took a huge hit, diplomacy is still the only way to secure our future in the world and in the Middle East, which means that us as civil society, while we have to remember that we are not diplomats, it is our job to push and continue to push diplomats and policymakers into respect the process that actually takes place in the Middle East right now, and not to allow it to be unseen but at the NPT, at the First Committee, at the TPNW, and to support it in any way possible, while looking, and this is because we're talking to a youth organization, by looking at all the things that we can do as civil society in order to remind that there is a process and that only diplomacy can work. I'll leave time for questions later, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I just want to say I especially appreciate the fact that you note the conventional nature of the conflict, and you clarify that while there was a nuclear element there, there's a long conventional history behind that conflict. Additionally, I think it was important that we got a diplomatic background of how many of these treaties were developed and how these recent issues are going to affect future negotiations and future diplomacy. It's particularly important, as you say, for us as a youth organization to know this background, but to stick with and to promote diplomacy the best we can. Thank you very much for that. Now I would like to move on to Dr. Emad. If you could share some information about regional dynamics and the future of nuclear nonproliferation as a result of this recent conflict.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Ibrahim, for this invitation. It's really been fantastic to hear what Sharon just introduced us to, because she gave us a good picture until the war. And in its aftermath, it gave us a good background. So what I would like to start with, and prior to doing so, Ibrahim, I'm not a doctor yet. I mean, I dropped out of my PhD program. But students go back to school. But the important thing is that I just want to make sure that, one day maybe, but not now. I want to bring that regional perspective that we discussed, and I will start my commentary primarily on just a little bit of context, that the 12-day war between Israel and Iran is over, but its impact and its shockwaves are still going across the Middle East and beyond. And while we think that the war has ended, on so many other fronts, it continues, like the shadow Cold War sort of adversarial relationship between Israel and Iran. So in this case, the cyber attacks haven't stopped. Explosions, assassinations, sanctions, diplomatic isolations, attempts at even derailing the Iran nuclear deal through snapback threats by the European partners to that deal. All of these things are still happening. So it is not just a fragile ceasefire, but it's one it still simmers and is still there, and it can explode at any time. And so within that context is where I would like to begin by saying that, why did this war happen? What did it actually change? And what can we do to prevent something far worse that is unfortunately ahead of us, unless we double down on what Sharon has already reminded us, that diplomacy ultimately is the only path forward. And those tool sets that we've got to advance diplomacy is well over, and it's available and is already underway. Therefore, we have to be able to repair the distrust that has happened with the crumbling of even the international legal or humanitarian or diplomatic agreements that are being flaunted left, right, and center. And so there's the demise of not just diplomacy, but the architecture that was created to contain the second post-World War era for it not to happen again. So all of these international institutions, conventions, treaties, and boiling it down to bilateral has become a wild, wild west. It's where might is right, is where a buffoon or an arrogant, greed, power-hungry individuals rule over hundreds of millions of citizens of this world. And they're making decisions for them, on behalf of them, even though they are not representative of the people as much as they believe to be. And this is at the crux of all of what is happening right now, the arrogance and the destruction of the fabric of societies and institutions that allowed for a realization ultimately that we can either have a mass destruction, a zero-sum game where we will kill millions and millions of people through weapons that are unseen once they are used, in terms of the destruction and death they will cause. A nuclear war between not only, forget about Russia and the United States, between India and Pakistan, between another nuclear weapon state, can erupt a climatic humanitarian crisis that will result in billions dead. This is a report that has come out recently that built on decades of data and modulation to predict what will be the impact of a nuclear war. I encourage you all to read that report. I will do my best to actually send the link, and partners of Middle East Treaty Organization, including IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, are the key actors in being the communicator of not just how mad it is that nuclear weapons still exist at a time of heightened pressure, heightened mistrust, and adversarial tensions that have erupted into war. Russia, Ukraine, EU, NATO, India, Pakistan, Iran, Israel, and other countries in the region. We are in the midst of a complete dynamic that is spiraling down. What do we do? Because I don't want to end by saying, hey, you already know this. What do we do? Sharon pointed it out. In the Middle East, we have already some mechanisms in place that we will advance through what we do and what we can do as civil society. Advocate, provide policy, provide advice, gather, combine, build a community, bring in the voices, bring in the solutions, converge, converse, communicate, negotiate, find the solutions that are already there and expand on those that don't exist yet, because the realm of possibilities is endless. Where you enter and where you join, it is when we can converge, and then it's an exponential growth of one wisdom of another. That is how we do it in the Middle East Treaty Organization, and that's how we want to advocate, not just on nuclear non-proliferation, not just on chemical weapons or biological weapons, but what is coming, emerging technologies, the threat of artificial intelligence, weaponization, autonomous weapon systems, and the dynamics, the geopolitical understanding that is necessary to fuse that with technical understanding and feasibility of legal instruments that will bring countries together to understand the risks that we are facing right now, not just for you and me, but for humanity and the ecosystem that sustains life on this planet. So it is not just the 9 nuclear weapon states that possess these means of destruction. It is the 196 other nations and the people within them that have the power to stop this mass hostage taking of 9 governments who possess nuclear weapons. That's why a global nuclear weapons campaign has to fuse with regional and national initiatives and then expanded into environmental issues on the future of our humanity and combine these thematic areas together so that we can achieve harmony within our environment, within our humanity, and how we then interact by empowering the tools for conflict resolution, transformation, and healing, and to advance that instead of the military industrial complex. That is why ultimately, again, at the base of the root of this is the need for a revolutionary thinking and a transformative agenda of how we can transform this current time of dire need where humanity can go in either direction. Let us come together to advance an alternative already existing track that humanity can go on instead of the spiraling down to the destruction that we are facing right now. With that, I would like to wrap it up by saying that the implications obviously are not just between Israel and Iran, they're regional, they're global, and we're all part of it. And we are also all part of the solution. So engage with us. Middle East Treaty Organization has a yearly program, educational program, dealing with the intersection between technology, security, and disarmament. And I invite you all, if you're interested, check it out, apply for it. We even have funding and scholarship for those who are from the Middle East, Africa, Global North, or you can't afford it. So check it out. I think the applications are actually open. And I will stop there and look forward to the question and answer sessions following the other speakers. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Emad. We greatly appreciate your remarks. The point that especially resonated with me was the idea of 9 nuclear armed states engaging in a sort of hostage taking. I think it's no coincidence that some of the most extended conflicts we've had over the past few years were they consisted of nuclear armed states as one of the parties or as both parties involved. Essentially, some of these countries, when push comes to shove, utilize this nuclear weapon capability to push past all international norms, to push past diplomacy, and really they perceive these conflicts to be bilateral in nature. But as you describe, every country and every nation has a stake. And as regional organizations and as civil society, we also have a lot of opportunity here to push our governments, whether we're a part of these 9 states or not, to make a big difference. So thank you very much for that. And now we would like to hear about the nuclear taboo and the weakening of NPT's credibility from Commodore Uday Bhaskar, Director of Society for Policy Studies in New Delhi. We are excited for your remarks, Dr. Uday, or Commodore Uday Bhaskar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
I am
we
hard
can
of
hear you.
hearing, so if any of you cannot hear me, please raise your hand, and I'll either try and speak more softly if I tend to speak more louder than I should. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to this conversation. I think it's a very valuable and worthy endeavor. I should also preface this by saying that I was mentioning to some of our other colleagues that I'm like Rip Van Winkle. I've been around for a very long time. I was born soon after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and I lived through greater part of the Cold War. And events like the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which for a younger generation may seem like ancient history, were events that are very, very recent in the collective memory. And when I heard that you were having this particular conversation, I must confess that I was very enthused, because for a long time, at least in the part of the world that I'm currently living in New Delhi, there seems to be a sense of apathy about nuclear weapons, complacency, a degree of indifference, that they are here to stay. And I'm conscious of the fact that we are having this conversation in the run-up to the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima, Nagasaki next week. And that is what had encouraged me to have a look at or review the whole concept or the notion of the nuclear taboo. I think I recognize some names and faces around this table who will recall that towards the end of the Cold War and in the first decade after December 1991, there were a number of deliberations in different parts of the world about the enormity of the nuclear weapon. And I think it was Hans Blix at that time, when we met in New York, we closed the session on saying Nagasaki should be the last time. This was a conference that we had under the Pugwash banner, if I remember right. But from then to now, I'm a military man. I've spent 40 years in the Indian Navy and have perhaps what might be called as one perspective on the enormity of the capabilities when it comes to WMD now, weapons of mass destruction. Not just the nuclear weapon and the tonnage that it can bring to bear. In contrast, Hiroshima and Nagasaki would seem like puny weapons when you look at what the world now has at its fingertips. And also the kind of delivery that is now possible, the kind of precision that is claimed. All of this has led to what I have written about, spoken about, to say that the sanctity of the nuclear taboo, that Hiroshima, Nagasaki will be the last time, does not have the kind of halo, if you will, about how that should temper the action of policymakers. There are a variety of reasons, I think, if you look at the last decade plus alone, as to why the global perception is that, one, nuclear weapons are here to stay. And even in professional circles, one is dismayed to see this casual reference to the use of nuclear weapons, battlefield nukes. I mean, when I first heard it, I was stunned to see how a new generation of military professionals, policy advisors at the highest levels of decision making in different countries were looking at the nuclear option as one more arrow in the quiver. We thought we had put all this behind the global collective policymakers' radar after what had happened in Europe, the INF, and the run up to the end of the Cold War. But as I said, if you look at this in a decadal manner, from the end of the Cold War in 1991 to where we are now, starting from 2021, the nuclear taboo, in my view, has been diluted considerably. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the various references made by President Putin and other members in his cabinet to the possibility that nuclear weapons could be invoked is one illustration. And that's not the only one. If there is one lesson, I would say, that has been drawn by some regimes across the world from Ukraine, is that Ukraine's surrender of nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War was a colossal blunder. And that today, if a country wants to ensure that it is not attacked with impunity by the major powers, in this case, we are looking at the United States, then perhaps it would be wiser to ensure that whether it's by hook or by crook, that you acquire this capability, and North Korea is case in point. There are many other examples, but time does not permit me to highlight them, to suggest that there has been a steady erosion of the sanctity or what was once seen as the nuclear taboo, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki will be the last time. And as my friend and colleague Emad had pointed out, more recent technological developments, whether it's AI or a range of other issues, have also given, to my mind, a false sense that the nuclear weapon can be managed. And even if it is used, this is another very interesting sociological kind of phenomena that I noticed, that Fukushima seems to have sent a strange message to policymakers that if we, as in policymakers, can manage Fukushima and the fallout, and we can also manage COVID, I have actually seen deliberations in closed doors talking about exclusion zones, even if the so-called battlefield nuclear weapon is used. As I said, all this is called for dismay. And I'm directing my remarks to the younger members who are around this table or in this particular conversation. But I think, my sense is, and I say this with sadness, I think our generation has let you down. I grew up with a fair amount of idealism. In civil society, amongst the global public intellectuals, we had people like Bertrand Russell, amongst others, who were like beacons, warning the world at a time when there was no internet, when there were no cell phones, there was no social media. But there was a kind of global resolve that nuclear weapons should be pushed back. That's a very long time ago, almost 50 years ago. And what dismays me now, as I said, there is complacence, there is misplaced certitude that nuclear weapons can be used in strategic and security templates. And to me, that is not only alarming, but cause for concern. Because today, most of our policymakers are in bubbles. They only listen to advisors who perhaps are unable to speak truth to power. And we are in a situation where layer upon layer of misplaced certitude is being added at the table of, well, particularly the Big Five, who have all differently increased their respective nuclear weapons. Emad and Sharon spoke about the nuclear nine. So there is a 5+4. And a very special responsibility devolves upon the five, the first five. And let me just briefly touch upon the second part of my remarks that I have. Ibrahim, do I have a couple of minutes or should I stop in the interest of time? If I have just 2 minutes, I'm sorry, I think I shouldn't have rambled on the first part, but it's about the weakening of the NPT. Again, let me add to remarks already made, very lucid remarks made by Sharon and Emad. That Iran, to my mind, is a case of weakening of the NPT, which itself is a slightly shaky treaty. Again, for Gen Next around this table, it's not really a treaty. For those of you who are inclined to read history of the weapon, coming from where I am in India, when the NPT debates were going on, the formulation here was that the major powers led by the United States and the former Soviet Union at that time were very keen to disarm the unarmed. So the foundations of the NPT itself, as I said, are questionable, but be that as it may, the treaty did play an important role in suggesting certain guardrails and considering that Iran had signed this as a non-nuclear weapon state, that it had given up the right to acquire these weapons. The manner in which it is attacked, I wrote about this. I'll be happy to share that if anybody wants to see it. But my one-liner is that this was impunity. This was arrogance, both of Israel and the United States, which had enabled it. And this leads to what I would call as a body blow to whatever remains of the NPT. And there must be some acknowledgement that we need to come back to some norm. There are no guardrails just now as far as the nuclear capability is concerned. And let me add to what Sharon has said, what Emad has said. Civil society must galvanize. I do not see any other way of sensitizing policymakers who are otherwise deaf, unless it is something that they want to hear. And how we do it, of course, is a matter of detail. I hope our younger members in this group will be able to share some of their own thoughts. As I said, our generation failed. But when Emad spoke about RMA, I've often said in other fora that we need an RHA, Romeo Hotel Alpha, an RHA, a revolution in human activism. There are many members in this group on the panel who represent the spirit of activism. But disarmament today is a dying flame, if you will. It needs to be revived by Gen Next. And I'll end with the same kind of advocacy that Nagasaki must be the last time. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Uday. Thank you very much. The point on battlefield nuclear weapons, I think, is especially helpful for our members. I know in the South Asian security context, it's become a particularly important point of discussion. It's something that I've read about as a Pakistani American. And thank you very much for leaving on a hopeful note that Hiroshima and Nagasaki must be the last, and activism will be important to reignite that dwindling flame of disarmament, which you highlighted earlier. Now we will hear about Pakistani perspectives, nuclear norms, erosions of international law, and extended deterrence from Dr. Salma Malik. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm most honored and grateful for having me as part of this wonderful exchange of views. It's been more of a learning rather than my being able to contribute much. I think such wonderful things have been said, and such conversations are really the order of the day. And David, Ibrahim, I'm extremely grateful for providing me with this opportunity. Now, I'm kind of like, so much has been said in this regard. I'm sort of like taking a lead from what Uday has mentioned. And when he said that he is from a generation that came after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this very famous axiom that may you live through interesting times. So many of us, when I teach my students, I always tell them that me being a 70s birth, we have seen a lot happening in our country, and we have really lived through interesting times. But little do you know that the world has a lot of surprises for you in order. And suddenly, the year 2025 brings you not one but two near nuclear wars, one between India and Pakistan, who have next to zero reaction time, both nuclear neighbors. And then very soon after that, we have yet another exchange, that is the Iran-Israel conflict taking place. Interestingly, this also brings us to this notion that the entire flavor of war has now changed. The traditional wars that we were more comfortable with, or which we actually knew, are no longer the norm. Now you have very different things taking place. And interestingly, you don't even need a very strong pretext to wage war. It can be the whims and fancies of dictators, ultranationalists. Uh, it can only be to appease your ideologues, to enhance your vote base, several other things. And that also means that you're keeping the safety of not only your adversary, whom you really don't care about much, but you're also keeping hostage the peace, stability, security, and safety of your own individuals. Because obviously, the retaliation and beyond visual range weaponry, smart technologies, destructive technologies, programs that have been used, drones and everything, they have made the entire war scenario very different from what it used to be. And now, no longer, I mean, especially when we look at the Pakistan and India exchange, we realized how different the war was and how swift the war was. But at the same time, it was also a very lethal exchange if it had to be. And then the Iran-Israel conflict, or the 12 days war that we talk about, also brought forth the very unfortunate glaring reality, which most of the speakers before me have talked about, and that is that the nuclear weapons are no longer considered to be the political weapons of political salience or currency. And the fact, and more so after May and then in June, the conversation between those who advocated for disarmament or who did not want to have been proven incorrect. Whenever they would say for many reasons, the course correction was immediate by saying that, as Uday has also pointed out, had Ukraine, had Iran gone for more weapons grade development and also things would have been different. So these conversations would always be there. But the Iran-Israel conflict that took place, the reason as to why Israel attacked Iran over the pretext of quote-unquote self-defense was the first breach of the international norm, because there was no self-defense which was being breached. However, the script had been long written because of Iran's help to the Palestinians, because of Iran's help to the militant Hamas, and and of course, in the last year, the drone exchange and the fight that had happened, bringing Iran to this fait accompli that if they would participate, then they would be attacked. If they were not they were not to participate, even then there was some pretext over which they would attack. Interestingly, if we talk about the nuclear weapons, a notion about Iran, then Iran actually was a very willing partner to have some kind of a nuclear conversation. The JCPOA, Iran wanted to honor that, and it was the Trump administration that walked out of the JCPOA. And of course, that also set the stage for the 6 rounds of conversation, of which 60 days deadline was already given by Donald Trump, in which Iran actually genuinely was invested in coming to some kind of an arrangement that would provide Iran with the notion that there is a nuclear agreement between the stakeholders involved, but this policy, which was doomed from the very beginning, which was engineered and made in this scenario that it would not work, so it didn't work. And the very next day, we have the Israeli strikes taking place against Iran, and a very dangerous example being set. Now, the example that was set as a result was that, and of course, the reason to do all this was to weaken Iran to a point where would it come to a complete agreement and a hands down yes to every dictate the Americans and the Israeli administration led by Netanyahu would put for them. And also, they wanted to have a regime change, which again is a violation of international norms. You cannot have willfully engineer regime changes within countries. And of course, as I said before, that many of these things have happened because there was need by the ultranationalists, the aggressors, amongst the aggressor states who wanted to have a stronger voter base, who wanted to have manufacture consent within the country, within their own countries, in order to have what they really wanted to. Unfortunately, the result was that the much talked about Iron Dome of Israel, or rather, I would actually say Netanyahu's Iron Dome, collapsed, and that myth totally shattered. Iran's regime, good or bad, unfortunately strengthened as a result of that. So that objective was also not really achieved. Iran, which still maintains a fatwa or a religious decree for not making nuclear weapons, may actually now actively go for having nuclear weapons, and it would have another fatwa and change its stance in the coming years. That also provides several other countries with a reason to go for a nuclear weapons option. Hence the point, the weakening of the NPT regime. The point that Uday and Emad both talked about, the usability of nuclear weapons, that has also kind of really made the situation dangerous for countries, because even in the case of India and Pakistan, flirting with conventional deterrence and coming very close to a tactical nuclear weapons threshold, and still very confidently touting that we know that we have complete control over our nuclear weapons and the various conventional thresholds, and nowhere had we thought about taking the nuclear path, is actually a very courageous way of looking at these things. But this is not how you play in the nuclear playbook. You really have to maintain a deterrence, a solid deterrence. But here, the new norm is not deterrence, but compelling or having compellence, providing your enemy with this or adversary with this pretext that they have to listen to you. So this is actually changing the entire norms or the rules of the game to such a point where we are provoking our adversaries into taking up new actions. Furthermore, it has also brought about a demise of the rule-based order. The rule-based order that the West really talks about and also implements selectively is long dead and buried by the West. And there has been very little appetite left for lawfare, which is so unfortunate. Last but not least, we also see that not only have the international organizations such as the UN, the ICJ, and now the IAEA become redundant and also compromised because of the role IAEA played in this particular game, or the role that has been associated with the IAEA, for the want of a better word, has totally compromised the neutrality and the role IAEA previously played in the international non-proliferation system. And this is a tragedy because no one is going to trust such organizations in the future. And that is something that these organizations and civil society or the international civil society really needs to look at. The wars have become all the more dangerous, primarily because of destructive technologies, use of AI tools, such as what Israel has, Where's Daddy, an app, another program such as the Lavender program, which is a facial recognition program. And these programs were used against Iran. That also brings forth the question of the sovereignty of countries as to how badly they are now compromised, and we have to rethink about the question of sovereignty. So all of these things put together, unfortunately, what we come about is that the appetite for peace, appetite for security and stability has become very little. The cost of war, the cost of conflict sounds very appealing. As a Pakistani, I would be slightly anecdotal and say one word that at the height of war against terror in Pakistan, when we were facing a lot of terrorist strikes, my niece, once when a bomb attack took place, she asked me, Auntie, how many people have been killed? And I said, fortunately, no one has been killed. And she said, how boring. There was a bomb strike and no one got killed. What type of bomb strike was that? So we are actually making the appeal for war very, very viable for state actors. We need to up the ante of war. We need to up the ante for the ramifications for war for everyone to rethink and reconsider entering into a conflict and a war for everyone, which unfortunately is not there. Dialogue, talking to each other, compromising, thinking of waging the war another day are now considered a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength by the states. And the chest thumping and the gung-ho approach by our decision makers have made their own countries and their own citizens hostage to the whims and fancies of these things. Lastly, but I would just very quickly go through the ramifications that this has had on Pakistan. Unfortunately, had the war been, had it continued any bit longer, or had there been a regime change, as was being considered by Israel, Pakistan and Iran share a huge shared population, the Balochistan province that we have, a Balochistan province on Pakistan's side. For those of our colleagues who are not familiar with the demography of these countries, and the Balochistan province, which is largely a barren desert and limestone space with very less population, is already a very volatile area for Pakistan. It has a lot of adversarial intel operators working there. It is volatile because of the militancy and secessionist movements which are being encouraged from outdoor. And of course, they have their domestic reasons that enforce these aspects. Had the war prolonged, a loss of control by Iran for its Sistan Baloch province would have carried immense ramifications for Pakistan. It would have also brought Israel intelligence right next door to Pakistan, and that is again something which was not a very likely and a choice scenario for Pakistan. In any case, Pakistan has been engaged in a very long-drawn conflict and counterterrorism effort during the 20 years war on terror in Afghanistan. And the Afghan scenario still remains volatile. So our Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which is the northwestern province, and Balochistan, which is the southwestern province, combined share a huge border stretch. And we could not afford to have such a huge border stretch becoming volatile. And that is something that Pakistan was quite worried about and looking at as to how to make these things better. Secondly, obviously, the spillover effects of this conflict having a population inflow into Pakistan would have also meant disaster consequences for the country. Already, we are trying to have the Afghan nationals return to their home, which has become a very political moot point between Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as those poor Afghan nationals who do not want to return to their country, as well as there are no countries who are willing to accord them asylum. So they are really left in the crossroads of these global politics, would have meant disastrous. It would have also had disaster consequences for the economy of Pakistani state. And last but not least, of course, that it would have meant that had the Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, that have set a precedence, which may mean that any country that wants to carry out strikes, such similar strikes against Pakistan or any other country, they can willfully do that, and they would find an endorsement from the bigger countries of the world, such as the US, which itself came and bombed the Iranian sites. Whatever the larger politics behind it, who really suffered? Did they really hit the right point? Did they really have bunker busters? That is not the thing. It is the symbolic value of striking the nuclear sites, which carries a lot of ramifications about the sovereignty, stability, and security of such regimes and such strategic assets. And I think, as everyone has said the same point, and I think that needs to be reinforced a lot more, and that is that unless and until we seriously deliberate about the efficacy of dialogue, of coming together, thinking of a shared future, thinking of aspects which are far more uniformly affecting us, such as climate change, such as many other reasons, we are actually participating in a world which is doomed to head into a complete disaster. We do not need to enforce the new norms of surgical strikes, of striking strategic assets and individuals. Rather, we need to revert back to something which is more humane, something which actually provides us with a breathing space, and we really, really need to look for the common good of the people. We don't need to endorse people who are willfully condemning the world to genocide. We selectively talk about genocide or crimes against humanity taking place in Afghanistan, but we don't talk about the genocide which is happening in Palestine. We need to have a very strong moral barometer through which we judge these miscreants and really treat them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Salma Malik. I wanted to say I particularly enjoyed your point that it's compellence rather than deterrence is what's going on with a lot of these nuclear weapon states. I think you see this when these nuclear crises happen, particularly between Pakistan and India, then they sort of they stop making the point that the situation is under control. In fact, both sides take advantage of the idea that the situation is actually completely out of control, and they use this to push for urgency and to push for the dialogue being resolved. So in these moments of crises, I think we can see the reality that there's not that much stability in the escalation ladder as they would like it to seem. And finally, last but not least, Dr. Ivana Hughes, President of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, we would love to hear concluding remarks to wrap up our great discussion today.
Thank you so much. I am really thrilled to be here with everyone and so grateful for all of the insight and thought-provoking remarks that have been given so far. I want to I think mostly just both in the interest of time, so we have some time for discussion, but also just tie a couple of things or pull on a couple of threads that have come up that really intrigued me. I want to follow up on something that Salma just said in regards to just how dangerous everything is getting with obviously technology getting more advanced. And it actually almost ironically made me think of an Einstein quote from the 1940s where he said, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but I know that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And I think that's really sort of where nuclear weapons have brought us, and all of the subsequent technology that we've had, which Commodore Uday stressed, the delivery systems. This is a very different world than 1945, when you had 3 weapons in possession of one country that had to be taken on airplanes, and dropped over cities. Now you can send nuclear warheads across oceans. You can send 10 nuclear warheads all at the same time towards the same target or different targets. I mean, and that's just one intercontinental ballistic missile, for example. So the level of the possibility for destruction is really just unfathomable. And Emad, in particular, referred to some of this work that really started in the 1980s. And I just want to kind of give a nod here to scientists who were actually thinking about a completely different phenomenon. They were thinking about what happened to the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Why did they disappear? Or all the large dinosaurs? Why did this mass extinction take place? And a number of discoveries led to a conclusion that an asteroid hit the Earth and created such climatic conditions that basically resulted in this mass extinction. And at that time, they sort of wondered, are there, besides another asteroid hitting the Earth, are there other things that could happen that would lead to such widespread destruction and elimination of life? And they realized that a case of nuclear war would have some parallels to the asteroid strike. In particular, that in a nuclear war, where hundreds or even thousands of nuclear warheads are used, there would be such widespread fires that would result in the formation of soot that would go high up into the atmosphere, block incoming sunlight, reduce temperatures to very large degrees. I often cite, this depends on the exact scenario, but 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, so something like 20 plus degrees Fahrenheit. And that this would, of course, mean that this becomes a very different planet. This becomes a planet on which food stops to grow, agriculture begins to fail, and people begin to starve. And it turns out that when it comes to nuclear weapons, this is but one example of the sorts of things nuclear weapons can do. It exemplifies this ability of nuclear weapons explosions to happen in one moment in time, but then to have these long-term impacts. Something else nuclear weapons do, which is spread of radiation, is something that also can have even longer effects over longer periods of time. Radiological contamination, depending on the exact isotopes we're discussing, can last for thousands of years. Nuclear weapons exploded very high in the atmosphere could also produce what is called the electromagnetic pulse, which could destroy electrical grids in entire countries. It's estimated that for the United States, you'd need about 3 nuclear weapons exploded at certain locations high above the atmosphere to shut down the entire electrical grid of the United States. There's also an effect from nuclear war that would be on the ozone layer. So this is also like nuclear winter, dependent on exact scenarios, but in the scenario of US and Russia using about 1/3 of their current arsenals, the ozone layer destruction is estimated to be at about 70%. So this is quite simply not a world in which you'd even want to live. Khrushchev had said, and this is, before some of these discoveries were made, in fact, the survivors would envy the dead. And what leads me, where all that knowledge and understanding leads me is to conclude that nuclear weapons specifically need to become not a symbol of power or progress or something that the country is proud of. They need to become a symbol of shame. This is what we need to turn them into. It should be states, governments should be ashamed of their not just ability, but even their professed commitment to use these weapons to save themselves. In the Cold War, the logic of MAD, mutually assured destruction, was very popular. It was never MAD. It was always SAD. It was always self-assured destruction, because there was never a way that you could even if you could, destroy your adversary without being, say, hit with nuclear warheads yourself. It was always going to end up in self-assured destruction because of these long-term, both, I've been talking about the time impact, but also in terms of space, nuclear weapons can have these global effects. And so you would always destroy yourself as well. Let me just I want to make just two more points. I want to make a point about probability. We have been living in the nuclear age for 80 years. And some people come to the conclusion we haven't used them, we'll never use them. They keep us safe. All of this I'd be happy to discuss in another opportunity. All of this is incredibly faulty. But there's a basic understanding of, in just probability in mathematics, that if you are going to do something that has even a very, very low probability of happening, if you're going to do it over and over and over again, it will happen. We know that we've actually not been so smart. We know that we have actually been lucky. Even the Cuban Missile Crisis, where President Kennedy made some good decisions, Chairman Khrushchev made some good decisions. Even then, there were moments during the crisis that were completely out of their control, where nuclear war could have started. Very famously, on October 27th of 1962, read about the Black Saturday and the events that took place then that would have, had they transpired and resulted in nuclear weapons use, could have ended the world, ended human civilization as we know it. None of us would have been here today to talk about it. So we've gone lucky. We can't get lucky forever. And the ultimate conclusion is that we have to get rid of nuclear weapons. And here I really want to endorse all of the views that have been shared in regards to the importance of civil society. I completely agree that civil society needs to continue to push for diplomacy, both for peace and disarmament. And I just want to say that I see peace and disarmament as not just, we just pursue peace or we just pursue disarmament. They go hand in hand. And they can be mutually reinforcing. So I think that's really important to note. When I think about just how terrible the situation is that we find ourselves in 2025, and that's been elaborated upon enough, I don't want to belabor that point. I always want to think about other times that were also extremely dangerous, but where progress had been made. One of those times was the 1960s. In fact, immediately after the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was Kennedy and Khrushchev who came together to negotiate the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Another time was the coming together of Reagan and Gorbachev, who reversed, let's just say it, the Cold War ended. They made tremendous progress on nuclear disarmament, reversed the nuclear arms race. That was another very, very dangerous moment in the Cold War. And for me, those two time periods are really exemplified by sort of two things. You had a very engaged general public. In the 60s, you had Women's Strike for Peace. You had people like Linus Pauling protesting on the streets, a Nobel laureate in chemistry. And then in the 1980s, you had the Central Park rally where 1 million people marched in New York City, and millions of people marched around the planet against nuclear arms. And so you need both. You need leaders who are going to be willing to change the status quo, but you also need an engaged public that's going to push them to that point. And as Sharon and Emad stressed, as everybody really stressed, Commodore Uday as well, the general public needs to, the civil society needs to be that voice that leads the general public on this. I want to just say one last thing in terms of international relations and sort of how we get to this peace and disarmament mutually reinforcing each other. We really don't need to reinvent anything. It's all in the UN Charter. We just actually need to follow the UN Charter. Just to give one specific example from recent years, it's often stated that Ukraine has a right to self-defense. And I don't deny that right is in the UN Charter. But what comes far before the right to self-defense is the responsibility to negotiate. And that responsibility is what we have to stress. That responsibility is that push for diplomacy that Sharon was emphasizing. That's what we need to say, that these diplomatic efforts need to match, if they even matched, in terms of human and financial investment, if they matched 1% of what we invest in terms of the military and the military industrial complex and all the human ingenuity, creativity, time, resources that go into making weapons, if we invest even a fraction of that into diplomatic efforts, we'd be in a very different place, in a much better place. I think what we have to recognize is that nation states must approach international relations with a kind of an outlook that's focused on peace, on collaboration, and yes, on competition. But we can compete economically, we can compete on sports fields, we can compete in scientific and artistic and other achievements. We should not be competing on battlefields, and we should not be competing on who has bigger and better weapons. So I'll end on that, and again, thank everybody so much for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much, Ivana. I think that was a wonderful note for us to end our panel discussion on. And now we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, if they would just raise their hand, and looks like we already have one. Mr. Kairolda, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Good morning, everyone. Who's in Asia? Good afternoon. My question is about we say we want diplomatic solution and a world free of nuclear threats, but how can that happen when the global system itself is built on double standards? For example, Israel is widely believed to process nuclear weapons, yet it has never signed the NPT. Meanwhile, Iran, which is under intense threat, security and pressure, does not have a bomb even, and yet faces sanctions, isolation, and threats. And if we want countries to trust diplomacy, how can we expect them to disarm or even cooperate when they see such a imbalance in the how nuclear capacity is tolerated or punished? How do we break the cycle of mistrust and selective enforcement?
Would anyone like to take on that question?
So I want to defer to my colleagues from the Middle East, but let me just start the discussion if that's okay. Is that okay, Sharon and Emad? Yes. There's no doubt that there has been this double standard, and really I've called it an irony that Israel has an undeclared nuclear arsenal. Actually, not only are they not a party to the NPT, they're the only state in the world that has nuclear weapons but has a policy of ambiguity. And I know Sharon has worked for many years to change this. To me, it's ironic that they're the ones attacking Iran over Iran's alleged nuclear weapons, which, as has been stated, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Now, Iran was enriching uranium to 60%, which is, far beyond what you need for civilian nuclear energy. But they have stated time and again that they did not want to build a nuclear weapon. So there's a little bit of, I'm not saying that, what the reason was for enriching to such high levels. I'll leave that aside. I think the other irony that we saw in the conflict is that the usefulness of force was taken, as a given, whereas diplomacy was actually under the JCPOA, which Donald Trump walked away from. Iran was probably 10 to 15 years away from building a nuclear weapon, whereas after the strikes, some of the estimates were that maybe they set them back by a few months or maybe a year or two. So clearly, diplomacy could have achieved something if the goal is to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Diplomacy could have been far more effective. And I think so. I'll stop there and defer to the experts.
So, if I can take the floor, first, some things that need to be said. Iran does have a nuclear weapon program, had a nuclear weapon program, and also use a language that perceived as if, at least in Israel, as if once they do have a nuclear weapon, they might use it on Israel, even though they didn't say it directly. So if you have a nuclear program and the language is a language of Israel shouldn't exist, even though they sometimes say that they only mean that the current administration shouldn't exist, or it doesn't help. Now, Israel ambiguity does two things very effectively. First, Israel, until the last government, never threatened directly with nuclear weapons. even in the conversation, just a little bit, this prime minister, until this last government that is full of extremists. And the ambiguity is part of that. So ambiguity, on one hand, meant that we're not flashing our nuclear weapons most of the time, but it did something that for Israel is much more dangerous, and that means that there is no discourse on nuclear issues whatsoever inside Israel. So even when this kind of war started, all that the journalists, even the main media, the think tanks had to talk about was just what they hear from the governmental level. And this is, again, part of what civil society needs to change. Now, the whole nuclear structure, the global nuclear structure, is not fair, is not right. We have the 5 nuclear states that their nuclear weapons are kind of legal because they did their tests before 1967. However, they are also the only states that actually sign on the nuclear on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that its Article 6 says very clearly that they do need to disarm. However, we are civil society. We are not states. If we keep looking at what the diplomats say and do, we will fail. There is no way for us to play the diplomatic game and win, because the diplomatic game is all about stagnation. The diplomatic game is all about leaving things as they are, because apparently the states are quite comfortable with the way things are. We need to be a disruptive voice, but reasonable one. And one of the things, for example, that Emad and I put in the first draft treaties for the WMD free zone was that first thing, that all states in the Middle East recognize the right of all states in the Middle East to exist. And that includes Israel, it includes Palestine, includes Iran, includes all of the states in the Middle East first. So this is not a diplomatic, maybe, language. It's an activist language that got into a diplomatic arena now at the November conference on the zone. And it is up to us to look at this hypocrisy around us, not in order to be discouraged, to put our hands up and say there's nothing we can do about it. We do have a voice that can change. It's important, it's imperative, though, that we will go back to what worked in the 80s, for example, for reduction talks. As civil society, as activists, as academia, we forgot to remind the people around us how dangerous these weapons are. In the 80s, the Cold War, that the fear of the end of mankind pushed diplomacy. Right now, we don't have it, even though we're closer to a nuclear war than we have ever been in history since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and since the Cold War. We are close to these nuclear weapons, and we are not willing sometimes to do what's necessary. And when I say willing to do what's necessary, for example, in the Middle East, we need to talk to Israel, even if we don't like what Israel is doing. But without talking to the forces inside Israel that might collaborate with what we want to achieve, we won't be able to move forward. And it is up to civil society to come together. If we all want nuclear weapon-free world, and I think that we do, I think that one of the things that we are lacking, maybe not me, but I'm a hippie, is the belief that it's possible. Do we believe that we can have a nuclear-free world? I believe that we can. And if we believe that it's possible, and it is possible in our lifetimes, then what is our plan? Are we willing to sit and consider a plan that might work and then pursue it? Push the diplomats without becoming lackeys of the diplomatic language that really aims to make us do nothing.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. John Morris, I saw that you had a question. If you could forward the question over, we can definitely get that to our speakers and perhaps exchange emails to make sure that the discussion can continue. It was a wonderful event. I just have one quick request.
Ibrahim, We're still in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Add 2 more minutes because we want to have Uday have a final say. We want to have me have a final say.
Exactly.
And I think it's important because we
Perfect.
got to
If
wrap
everyone's
this up.
willing to stay on, in that case, we
Yeah, whoever wants to go can go. Whoever wants to stay can stay. It's all good. We're free.
perfect. We love
But
it.
what is important is that let everybody wrap up. I think will be important because I have a few things I want to say.
Wonderful. In that case, let's keep it going. David will be taking a picture as well while we continue our discussion. So if everyone could just turn their cameras on if they're comfortable with that. And since we have the time, John Morris, would you like to ask your question and direct it to the speaker?
I would like to thank you all for a wonderful event. I'm in England, and at present we have a very warmongering government. I don't have a question for you. I really have to state what is happening in Britain. In July 17th, a plane arrived from America with tactical nuclear weapons made in America, based at RAF Lakenheath. These are weapons which are tactical. Already have 225 nuclear weapons of our own. But for some reason or another, our Prime Minister.
You've muted yourself.
John, you're muted. I'm going to jump on what John said because I think it will center on what we got to discuss, as
Perfect.
Sharon mentioned. That it's not about one country or the other, one pursuing, one having. It's about 9 countries. Don't overcomplicate it. It's 9 countries with nuclear weapons, and there are 5 what is known as umbrella nuclear sharing program under NATO. Those are Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Turkey. Okay? 14 countries. And a couple of countries on edge, like Iran. If they want to go for it, they can go for it. Japan can too. Brazil too, by the way. So there are those threshold countries. But our concern is over this 15. 5 of them are actually in the European sort of continents. There are tailored approaches. Local knowledge is important in any activism or campaign. If we understand that, as John mentioned, there are tactical nuclear warheads that are being brought by the United States and going to be stationed in X, Y, Z air base or military base, it's not that complicated to figure out what that is. What does that mean? It allows us to map out where are we focusing and targeting our campaigning and activism for nuclear weapons disarmament. They're not in the air. They are physically somewhere. And in most cases, they're blurred out in Google. Even if you look over Little Belgium, there's an air base and it's blurred out. Why? Because US nuclear warheads are stationed there. Does the Belgian population know that this is happening around them? Maybe they don't. That's where we need campaigning specific to the Belgian public. There needs to be campaigning specific to the Israeli public. And the list goes on into these countries. So we need expertise. We already have it here. Uday in India, that's a nuclear weapons state. Him and his cohort of organizations and NGOs and civil society know the direction, the language, the tactics that are necessary to bring across the message to the masses that your nuclear weapons will not protect you against Pakistan. No Pakistan will protect it from you. As Ivana mentioned so beautifully, is mutually assured destruction is actually wrong, is self-assured destruction. I'm saying this because we need to be able to communicate and send a message to the bullies of our world, to those who are not only wrote the rules, and now they are transversing the rules and breaking the same rules they created in the first place. And they said they will be committed to and made everybody else be committed to. That Iran is a case in point. Iran is a warning. Iran shows us what is happening when belligerence and greed and power are concentrated in the hands of a few who have the codes and the ability to launch weapons that can destroy our species. This is what we have to realize, that at the crux of this is the requirement for the masses to realize that power is not in the hands of a few, power is within you. And therefore, you require civil society to converge, to fuse, to realize that you and me are not alone in this world. That there's actually millions of voices, millions of people who are doing their part in bringing across the truth about the madness and the insanity of these weapons and the people behind them that advocate for their utility when there is none, that it doesn't serve you, your nation, your interests, your security, and you will not have your ability to have that eternal security without the security of the collective. And the collective requires us to understand that a Pakistani deserves dignity, sovereignty, and security, both on a human level, an environmental level, and on a governance level. And so does an Indian, so does a North Korean, so does an Israeli, so does a Palestinian. And that is at the crux of it. And you know what? These Europeans figured out a couple of things. Now they're becoming a fascist state. But, they figured out that, instead of killing each other after 2 world wars, let's collaborate, integrate, and form a bloc called the European Union that protects our interests as a collective. It's still divided and separated from the rest of what is attached to, which is the Middle East and North Africa. They don't want to recognize that they are surrounded by people that look like me and Sharon. But the reality is that we are literally their neighbor. And they think that they can have their security with the ability to fund, allow, permit on a diplomatic, political, social, economic, even religious undertones, the ability of nations to continue the means of war that is destroying and bleeding the Middle East and the people that look like me and Sharon. And that's the crux of it. Look at the CPRI numbers. Who is funding and enabling this war? These weapons don't fall from the sky out of nowhere. There's a whole industry building it, profiting from it, extracting from it, and egging on this division and the use of violence to mitigate and resolve conflict. Conflict is natural. Its resolution requires tool sets. One is weaponization and violence. The other is dialogue, understanding, negotiations, cohabitation, and coexistence, and collaborative ways of moving forward. That's what we need, and push it, advance for it, advocate for it, do it your way, and join us, speak with us, engage with us, and Ivana and all these amazing other characters that are on this call who can allow us the opportunity to partake in building a future that is possible that we have already started today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for your love.
All right.
All right, Ibrahim, that's what I wanted to say.
No, wonderful. Thank you. Sharon, Uday, would you like to make some concluding remarks as well?
I'll defer to Sharon.
Just one sentence. I would like to tap on what Emad said and say that in the Middle East Treaty Organization, yes, we're talking about the Middle East, but in a way because we were pushed to talk about our own region as, sorry to make a big assumption here, as people of color usually are invited to speak about their own experience and not globally. But it is in METO's mission to start a working group. And we're starting it this year, a working group of people that come from nuclear armed state or nuclear umbrella state to have a direct campaign aimed at the people in these states. And if any of you is interested in joining us, it will be amazing. We think that there should be a special message to people in the nuclear arms states because they are the people that have something to give up on, and that's the dream that these nuclear weapons keep them safe somehow.
Thanks, Ibrahim. If I could take a couple of minutes, is that okay? No, just to add to what has been said by my esteemed colleagues on this panel. I should first confess that I'm an advocate for nuclear disarmament and zero nuclear weapons, and I can see some kindred souls around this group. But very often I used to feel that I'm like Don Quixote tilting at the windmill, but I'm also my own Sancho. And one of the thoughts I had, there are many of them, but just to pick up the thread from what has been said by John, by Ivana, Sarah, Emad, and Sharon, I said that we need a revolution in activism, human activism. And one of the strands I've often tried to highlight is that we need the younger generation. I think many of us have more yesterdays than tomorrows. It's a pity that we couldn't get to hear the voices of the younger generation, apart from Ibrahim and David, I presume. But just as we talk about technology and WMD, I think there are many possibilities for technology to provide traction to civil society. Let me compress, a lot of thoughts that one has into the equivalent of a Twitter kind of feed. But today, the nuclear landscape has become arid. And as many of you have pointed out, there is a certitude that these weapons are there to stay and that they are required for security, however it is perceived. I think we need many plows to turn this arid landscape and make it more malleable. And we need many streams to irrigate it. And make the point that Sharon has said that we need civil society to disrupt in a permissible way and hold the feet of policymakers to fire about their responsibility. But as I said, I'll stop here. But those of you who want to take this forward, I'm sure we can get into a couple of bilaterals, or if this group is willing to meet again, I'm sure we can take this conversation forward. But thank you very much again for inviting me to be part of these deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commodore Uday. No, definitely, we plan on continuing engagement. It's been such a wonderful panel, and all of our speakers are so gracious to continue to stay on. We really love the discussion here at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and our youth initiative, Reverse the Trend. These are the sorts of discussions we like to host so that younger activists can learn from those who came before us and implement these lessons into our activism moving forward.